Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 9 in Genesis chapter 39, and we'll begin reading in verse 12. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he has brought in a Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. And I'll stop reading there. Okay, we see that Potiphar's wife lies concerning what happened as Joseph came into the house. She was the instigator, not him. She was the adulterous one, and on a daily basis. And when Joseph refused her advances, then having got a hold of his garment, she came up with a plan to really turn things around and accuse Joseph of doing what she had been doing. And she must have been very upset with him and angry with him. And so she told her husband, Potiphar, that Joseph had done these things, and then Potiphar was justly angry. His wrath was kindled, and he put Joseph into the prison where the king's prisoners were bound. And that's how this passage concludes, and then we'll read starting in verse 21 of Joseph and his beginning experience in the prison. But before we get into this, I like to discuss something related to Potiphar. There was a listener who contacted me and pointed out that Potiphar, or the language that describes Potiphar, being an officer of Pharaoh, may indicate that he was a eunuch. And if we go back to Genesis 39, or the first verse of this chapter, Genesis 39, verse 1, it says there, And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. The word officer of Pharaoh, is a word that is translated as eunuch many times. It's also translated as officer or officers, normally in relationship to the royal court, a servant of a king. And yet it is translated as eunuch in, we could go to Isaiah 39, Isaiah chapter 39, verse 7. And there it says, "And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And that was God's prophecy to Hezekiah, King Hezekiah of Judah. And also in Isaiah chapter 56, we read in verses 3 and 4, "Neither let the son of the stranger that has joined himself to Jehovah speak, saying, Jehovah hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith Jehovah unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant. Unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." And the word eunuch and eunuchs, plural, in those verses is this word officer or officers when it's plural. And we read also in Jeremiah chapter 38, Jeremiah 38, verse 7. "Now when Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs which was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, the king then sitting in the gate of Benjamin." And Ebed-melech was used of God to rescue Jeremiah out of the dungeon, out of the pit. And he was a eunuch that served in the king's house. And again, whenever we read the word eunuch, it could be translated officer. And yet we understand that oftentimes in ancient civilizations, when they would bring someone into the king's house where the king's wives would be, and possibly for other reasons, they would turn them into a eunuch, castrating them, and then they wouldn't have to worry about any kind of, sexual difficulties or relationships going on in the palace amongst the royal family or anything like that. And so Ebed-melech the Ethiopian was turned into a eunuch, but from everything we can read, so was Daniel and his friends when they were carried to Babylon. We read in Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 3, or I'll just read verse 3 and then skip to a few other verses in this chapter. Daniel 1:3, "And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes." Now this would serve to fulfill the prophecy we read in Isaiah 39, that Hezekiah's sons would be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon, because some of these children are of the king's seed. And then it says in verse 7, "Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego." And then verse 8, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king," and so forth. So, given that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are under the authority of the prince of the eunuchs, there's a strong implication that they were made eunuchs. And that's why the prince of the eunuchs is feeding them, nourishing them, instructing them. He's teaching them how to be a proper eunuch within the kingdom of Babylon. And eunuchs were often made or considered to be officers of the court. We have the example in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, of the Ethiopian eunuch. It says in Acts chapter 8, in verse 27, and he rose and went. This is referring to Philip. And behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning and sitting in his chariot, read Isaiah the prophet. And this man is soon baptized by Philip, and from every account or every indicator, he became a true child of God. God saved the Ethiopian eunuch, which reminds us of what he had said in Isaiah 56. Though a man be a eunuch, God would give him a name of a son, an everlasting name. And yet this eunuch had great authority under Candace, the queen of Ethiopia. So that's one of the reasons why the word officer became so associated with the word eunuch. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they become officers, don't they, within the kingdom of Babylon. Remember, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who refused to bow down to the king's image and were thrown into the midst of the fiery furnace, and yet survived because God fully protected them. And afterward, we read at the end of Daniel chapter 3, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And they would have had positions of authority and power, just as Daniel. Daniel was a great man within the kingdom of Babylon for interpreting the king's dream. But even before that, the fact that he could get near the king and even be considered as a possible interpreter indicated he had a position of official authority of some kind. And so the eunuch was interchangeable, or became interchangeable, with the idea of an officer. Now, when we read the word eunuch, we can think officer. And likewise, when we read the word officer, we can think eunuch. Although I would still allow for the possibility in our account in Genesis 39 with Potiphar and his wife, that maybe it's possible in certain kingdoms for the word officer to have been applied to individuals who maybe were not eunuchs. I don't know that. I'm just saying that it could be a possibility. And the only reason I'm saying that is because Potiphar has a wife, historically. Although there could also be explanation for a eunuch to have a wife in the sense that he could have gotten married for social reasons, just someone to host his parties, since he is a man in position of power and authority. Or he could have gotten married for political reasons, as families come together in marriage, yet have been a eunuch. I think that's also possible. But just because he did have a wife, I think or at least I would allow for the possibility maybe he wasn't a eunuch. However, when we're looking at the spiritual meaning of this word, translated officer, and it's referring to Potiphar, it's calling him a eunuch. Potiphar, a eunuch of Pharaoh. That is how we can understand that word. That word is the same word as these other verses where it's translated eunuch. And that means when we're looking at the spiritual meaning, and that's our real interest. Potiphar's actual condition, eunuch or not a eunuch, is a slight curiosity, when we're reading the Bible. That he had a wife is what makes it curious. But our interest isn't in the living arrangement between this man and his wife. Our interest is in who he represents spiritually, and we have seen he represents God spiritually. God married to national Israel. Potiphar's wife, a type and figure of Israel. And what does this tell us about that relationship? And it would have application. It definitely would have application. God would not use this word if he did not want us to look at a spiritual scenario wherein Potiphar, who's a figure of God in the marriage relationship with Israel, and he's Lord over this house that Joseph comes to do service in, that Potiphar, in his relationship with his wife, we can gather there was no intimacy. There was no intimacy. That's one thing that we would gather spiritually, that this is teaching us between God and Israel. There was no intimacy. There was no relationship, really, between husband and wife other than in appearance, other than the fact that they had entered into a marriage of some sort. And I think we can see that, God's marriage to Israel is kind of strange anyway. When we think about it, it's an unusual marriage. We know that God is married to his elect people, that Christ is the bridegroom, and each one who became saved is the bride. And that's true throughout the whole history of the world. That spiritual marriage between Christ and his people has been in operation whenever someone became saved. We also know that God is married to mankind. The law of God is in a marriage relationship with every human being. And when a sinner married to the law sins, he's committing spiritual adultery against his husband, the law of God. And that's why the law condemns him as an adulterer, or her as an adulteress, and will take vengeance on the last day by stoning them to death or bringing them to death in payment for breaking the law. And we get that, or we understand these two types of marriages. But the marriage to Israel is different. It's different than either one of those. When God entered into a marriage with Israel, it was actually a marriage to the institution. For example, if we go to Jeremiah 3, in Jeremiah chapter 3, God tells us of this marriage in Jeremiah 3, starting in verse 1. They say, if a man put away his wife, and she go from him and become another man's, shall he return unto her again? Shall not that land be greatly polluted? Now, first of all, notice marriage to a wife is being likened to a land here. Shall not that land be greatly polluted? But thou hast played the harlot with many lovers. Yet return again to me, saith Jehovah. Lift up thine eyes unto the high places, and see where thou hast not been lying with. In the ways hast thou sat for them, as the Arabian in the wilderness. And thou hast polluted the land with thy whoredoms and with thy wickedness. Wherefore the showers have been withholden, and there has been no latter rain, and thou hast a whore's forehead, thou refusest to be ashamed. And down in verse 8, and I saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So here God is speaking of his marriage to Israel, and that he gave her a bill of divorce. And that's how we know it's not the law. It's not the law. You know, I was thinking of that. It was God's marriage relationship to Israel sort of an outworking of his marriage to the law, because Israel was duty bound to be faithful and keep the law of God and to worship God only, to serve God only. And when they failed to do so, God found fault with them and judged them repeatedly over and over and over again. So there was this type of legal relationship that obligated Israel to obey and be faithful in a similar way as mankind is married to the law and duty bound to be faithful and obedient, and yet mankind fails, and as a result comes under judgment. So there is similarity there, yet it's more than that. It must be more than that, because there's no divorce. There's no divorce from breaking the law as far as mankind's marriage to the law of God. The law of God does not divorce all fallen mankind because they have sinned against him and say, now, all right, I'm no longer married to you. God doesn't do that with mankind, but rather mankind is held responsible and accountable and comes under judgment for their failure, and the final judgment is death. The wages of sin is death. But with Israel, it was similar to the marriage with the law of God and each individual man. There was that obligation to obey, but and God judged them when they were disobedient. But it was the land. It's the idea of being married to an institution, to an entity, rather than to the individuals. Each of the individuals, let's say, or we know the vast majority of the individuals within the nation of Israel over the course of its history were themselves unsaved. And yet they would die for breaking the law personally, individually. They would not die for breaking the law of the institution, for violating the laws of Israel. Well, yes, God could bring judgment on the city by the Babylonians, and some of them would die in that. But ultimately, they would die and not live or enjoy eternal life because of their failure to keep the whole law of God as an individual in that marriage, not the corporate marriage of national Israel. So it does get a bit complicated, but in the marriage between God and Israel, there was very little intimacy right from the beginning. Right from the beginning, there was certainly no, I think I just want to leave it at that. There's different areas we can consider and think about that it just doesn't seem to go too far as my understanding is concerned in these areas. But I can see that at least, that the fact that Potiphar is a eunuch married to his wife, and his wife is an adulterous wife. One thing we should say, that if she was married to a eunuch, historically, that doesn't excuse her. That does not give her license or justify her going after another in any way. Because in marriage, no matter who you marry, no matter the physical, condition of the one you marry, you are married, and you are to be faithful, and marriage is to be honorable in all with that one person that you have married, and with no one else. And so Potiphar's wife is still, even if her husband were a eunuch, guilty of adultery. We have to stress that and make sure that is clear. Sinners love to justify their sins. Oh, my husband doesn't love me, or my wife, she's this or that. And no, there is no excuse. There is no justification for any kind of sin. When we sin, it's never justified in any way. Okay, well, when we get back together in our next study, we're going to continue looking at the spiritual picture here in Genesis chapter 39.
Thank you for joining us for eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.